The autumn morning mist clung to the windows of Windsor Castle like secrets waiting to be revealed. Inside the grand corridors, footsteps echoed with a different rhythm than usual. Today marked a significant day in the royal household, though few would understand its true meaning until years later. Queen Elizabeth II sat in her private study, her weathered hands holding a document that had been prepared months in advance. The paper bore the official seal, but its contents were known to only 3 people in the entire kingdom. At 86 years old, the Queen had witnessed countless changes in the world, but this particular morning felt different. The weight of tradition and the burden of foresight pressed heavily upon her shoulders. Prince George had turned 12 just 3 days prior, and while the public celebrated with typical royal fanfare, something far more significant was happening behind the scenes. The Queen's personal secretary, Margaret Thornfield, had been with the royal family for over 2 decades. She had seen many secrets come and go, but nothing quite like what was unfolding now. "Your Majesty," Margaret said softly, entering the study with her characteristic discretion, "Commander Harrison is here as requested." Commander James Harrison had served as the head of the Queen's personal guard for 15 years. His loyalty was unquestionable, his discretion absolute. At 52, he possessed the rare combination of military precision and diplomatic sensitivity that such a position required. He had protected the Queen through countless public appearances, state visits, and private moments, but today's meeting would test his understanding of duty in ways he never anticipated. The Queen looked up from her document, her eyes meeting Harrison's with an intensity that spoke of grave importance. "Commander, please sit," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her mahogany desk. "What we discuss today must remain between us until the time is right to act." Harrison took his seat, his posture perfect despite the obvious weight of the moment. He had been summoned to private meetings before, but something in the Queen's demeanor suggested this was different. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the room filled with centuries of royal history. "Commander," the Queen began, her voice steady but carrying undertones of deep concern, "you have served our family with unwavering dedication. Today, I must ask something of you that goes beyond your normal duties. It concerns Prince George and a tradition that has protected our monarchy for over 300 years. The document in her hands seemed to grow heavier as she spoke. Harrison noticed that her usual composure carried a trace of something he had never seen before, uncertainty mixed with resolute determination. The Queen had always been a pillar of strength, but today she seemed to be carrying the weight of history itself. "Your Majesty," Harrison responded, his voice measured and respectful. "I am at your service, as always." The Queen nodded slowly, then placed the document on the desk between them. "What I am about to share with you is known only to the monarch and 2 trusted advisors in each generation. It is called the Succession Protocol, and it has been enacted only 4 times in our family's history. The last time was when my father was Prince George's age." Harrison's eyes remained fixed on the Queen, though his mind raced with questions. He had studied royal history extensively as part of his training, but he had never encountered any reference to such a protocol. The silence in the room was broken only by the steady ticking of an ancient grandfather clock that had witnessed countless royal decisions. "Prince George has reached the age where certain preparations must be made," the Queen continued. "Not for any immediate danger, you understand, but for a possibility that we hope never comes to pass. There are forces in this world that most people never see, political undercurrents that could threaten not just our family, but the stability of the monarchy itself." The Queen's words hung in the air like morning fog, dense with implication. Harrison had always known that the royal family faced unique security challenges, but this seemed to go beyond conventional threats. His training had prepared him for assassination attempts, terrorist plots, and public disturbances, but the Queen's tone suggested something far more complex. "The Succession Protocol," she explained, opening the document to reveal pages of carefully handwritten text, "requires that when a direct heir to the throne reaches 12 years of age, they must be prepared for a possibility that we pray never occurs. It involves creating a secure pathway to safety, establishing alternative identities, and most importantly, ensuring that the line of succession can continue even under the most extraordinary circumstances." Harrison felt a chill run down his spine. The implications of what the Queen was describing began to sink in. She was talking about preparing for a scenario where the royal family might need to disappear, where Prince George might need to become someone else entirely to survive. Your Majesty, he said carefully, what exactly are you asking me to do? The Queen's expression softened slightly, showing a glimpse of the grandmother beneath the crown. I am asking you to become Prince George's shadow guardian. Beginning immediately, you will begin discreet preparations. You will establish safe houses, create alternative documentation, and, most importantly, you will begin training Prince George in skills that go far beyond royal protocol. The weight of responsibility settled on Harrison's shoulders like a heavy cloak. He had sworn to protect the royal family with his life, but this was asking him to prepare for scenarios that seemed more suited to spy novels than royal duties. Yet the Queen's earnestness left no doubt about the seriousness of the situation. The training, the Queen continued, must appear to be normal childhood activities. Prince George must learn self-defense, but he will think it's martial arts lessons. He must learn to blend in with common people, but he will believe it's about understanding his future subjects. He must learn survival skills, but they will be presented as outdoor education and adventure training. Harrison nodded slowly, beginning to understand the scope of what was being asked. And his parents, Your Majesty? Prince William and Catherine? They know nothing of this, the Queen replied firmly, and they must not know. This knowledge is a burden that falls to the monarch and the chosen guardian. It has always been this way. My father knew nothing when he was 12. I knew nothing when Charles was 12. It is only when one becomes monarch that the full weight of this responsibility is revealed. The morning sun had climbed higher during their conversation, but the study seemed to grow darker with each revelation. Harrison realized he was being initiated into one of the monarchy's deepest secrets, a tradition so closely guarded that it existed in parallel to the royal family's public life. There have been moments in our history, the Queen explained, when this protocol might have been necessary. During the wars, during certain political crises, times when the very existence of the monarchy hung in the balance. We hope it will never be needed, but we must be prepared. Harrison's mind turned to practical considerations. What kind of timeline are we working with, Your Majesty? The preparation phase lasts until Prince George turns 18, she replied. By then, he will have acquired all the necessary skills without ever knowing their true purpose. If the protocol is never needed, he will simply have had an exceptionally well-rounded education. If it is needed, her voice trailed off, leaving the unspoken implications to hang in the air. I understand, Your Majesty, Harrison said, though he wasn't sure anyone could fully understand the magnitude of what was being asked. When do I begin? You begin today, the Queen said, standing from her chair with the grace that had defined her long reign. Margaret has prepared a private apartment for you near the family quarters. You will become Prince George's personal instructor, teaching him what the family will believe is an advanced curriculum designed to prepare him for his future role. As Harrison rose to leave, the Queen placed a gentle hand on his arm. Commander, I know this seems overwhelming. My grandfather asked the same of someone when my father was 12. That guardian served faithfully for 6 years and never had to use any of his preparations. We hope your service will be equally uneventful. The weight of 3 centuries of tradition settled upon Harrison as he left the Queen's study. In the corridor outside, life continued as normal. Servants went about their duties, guards maintained their posts, and somewhere in the castle, a 12-year-old prince was probably doing his regular lessons, completely unaware that his life had just taken a dramatic turn. Margaret was waiting for him with a folder containing his new orders and living arrangements. As he walked through the familiar corridors that now felt charged with new meaning, Harrison couldn't help but think about the extraordinary trust that had just been placed in him. He was now the keeper of a secret that could change the course of British history. The afternoon brought Harrison's first official meeting with Prince George in his new capacity. The young prince was polite but curious about why he needed a new instructor. Harrison had prepared for this moment, crafting explanations that were both truthful and misleading. Your grandmother believes you're ready for more advanced training, Harrison explained to the bright-eyed 12-year-old. Leadership, physical fitness, cultural understanding, things that will make you an exceptional future king. Prince George seemed excited by the prospect. Like most children his age, he was eager for new challenges and adventures. Harrison felt a pang of guilt, knowing that these lessons would be far more than the boy bargained for. But he also felt a fierce protectiveness toward this young prince who had no idea what storms might lie ahead. As the day ended and Harrison settled into his new quarters, he opened the protocol document the Queen had given him. Page after page of detailed instructions, contingency plans, and historical precedents. He was struck by how thoroughly this system had been developed over generations, each monarch adding their own insights and experiences to protect future heirs. The document contained maps of safe routes out of the country, contacts in various governments who could be trusted, and detailed instructions for creating new identities. It read like a masterclass in covert operations, passed down through royal bloodlines like a secret inheritance. Harrison realized that tomorrow would mark the beginning of a double life, maintaining his public role while secretly preparing for scenarios that existed only in the shadows of possibility. As he prepared for sleep, one thought echoed in his mind. The Queen had trusted him with the future of the monarchy itself, and he would not fail that trust. 3 weeks had passed since Commander Harrison received his extraordinary assignment, and the carefully orchestrated training of Prince George had begun in earnest. What appeared to the royal household as an enhanced educational program was, in reality, the implementation of a centuries-old survival protocol that would prepare the young prince for scenarios no 12-year-old should ever have to consider. The morning sessions took place in a specially converted room in the castle's east wing. To anyone observing, it looked like an impressive private gymnasium and study space. In reality, every element had been designed with the succession protocol in mind. The mirrors could be quickly removed to reveal hidden compartments containing emergency supplies. The exercise equipment doubled as training tools for skills far beyond physical fitness. Even the books on the shelves had been carefully selected to include survival manuals, disguised as adventure stories. Prince George arrived for his 4th week of training with the enthusiasm typical of a boy who thought he was receiving special preparation for his royal duties. His instructors had told his parents that the program would make him more well-rounded and better prepared for public life. What they hadn't mentioned was that he was learning skills that could one day save his life. "Good morning, Your Highness," Harrison greeted the prince as he entered the training room. "Today we're going to work on what I call situational awareness. It's a skill that great leaders need to develop." Prince George's eyes lit up with curiosity. Throughout their sessions, Harrison had proven to be unlike any instructor the prince had encountered. Where his other teachers focused on history, mathematics, and languages, Harrison taught lessons that felt more like games and adventures. The boy had no idea that what he perceived as fun challenges were actually sophisticated training exercises. "What kind of situations?" Prince George asked, settling into one of the chairs that Harrison had arranged in the center of the room. "Well," Harrison began, activating a large screen that descended from the ceiling. "Imagine you're visiting a foreign country for a state function. You need to be able to read a room, understand who might be friendly or unfriendly, and know where the exits are at all times." The screen displayed what looked like a formal reception, complete with dozens of people in evening wear. To Prince George, this seemed like preparation for the diplomatic events he would attend as an adult. Harrison, however, was teaching him threat assessment and escape route identification. "I want you to study this scene for 2 minutes," Harrison instructed. "Then I'll ask you some questions about what you observed." As Prince George examined the image with the intense focus that Harrison had been cultivating, the commander reflected on how well the boy was adapting to the training. The prince possessed a natural intelligence that made him an ideal student for the protocol's requirements. More importantly, he approached each lesson with genuine enthusiasm, never questioning why his education had suddenly become so unconventional. "Time's up," Harrison announced, switching the screen to black. "Now, without looking back, can you tell me how many exits you saw in that room?" "3, Prince George replied confidently. "The main entrance where we came in, French doors leading to a balcony on the right, and what looked like a service entrance behind the buffet table." "Excellent. And did you notice anything unusual about any of the guests?" The prince furrowed his brow in concentration. There was a man near the balcony doors who wasn't talking to anyone else. He kept looking toward the main entrance instead of paying attention to the people around him. Harrison felt a surge of pride. In just 3 weeks, Prince George had developed observation skills that many trained security professionals took months to acquire. The boy's natural curiosity and intelligence made him exceptionally suited for this type of training, though he remained blissfully unaware of its true purpose. Very good, Harrison said, making notes in a file that would eventually become part of the protocol's permanent record. Now, let's talk about what you would do if you found yourself separated from your security detail in a crowded place. The afternoon session shifted to what Harrison called cultural integration exercises. To Prince George, these seemed like fascinating lessons about how ordinary people lived their lives. In reality, he was learning how to blend in with common citizens, a skill that could prove vital if he ever needed to disappear into the general population. Today we're going to visit the village, Harrison announced, producing clothing that was decidedly non-royal. Jeans, a simple sweater, and ordinary trainers. I want you to observe how people interact when they don't know who you are. Prince George found this prospect thrilling. He had always been curious about life outside the palace walls, and these excursions felt like secret adventures. Harrison had carefully arranged for these outings, ensuring that they would encounter pre-selected individuals who had no knowledge of the prince's true identity. They made their way to a small village about 20 minutes from the castle, where Harrison had established what he called observation posts, ordinary locations like cafes and shops where Prince George could practice blending in. The exercise was designed to teach him how to modify his speech, posture, and mannerisms to avoid drawing attention. Remember? Harrison instructed as they approached a local coffee shop. You're just George today. You're visiting the area with your Uncle James. You go to a regular school, and your biggest worry is your upcoming mathematics exam. The transformation was remarkable to watch. Prince George adjusted his posture, letting his shoulders relax and his pace become more casual. He had been practicing what Harrison called ordinary body language for weeks, and the results were impressive. To any casual observer, he looked like any other 12-year-old boy spending time with a family member. Inside the coffee shop, Harrison watched as Prince George successfully ordered a drink using the common accent and informal speech patterns they had been practicing. The boy engaged in light conversation with the teenage server, discussing school and weekend plans with such naturalness that Harrison began to believe the protocol might actually work if it were ever needed. "Your nephew's very polite," the girl behind the counter told Harrison as they prepared to leave. "Thank you," Harrison replied, feeling a complex mix of pride and sadness. "We try to raise him right." As they walked back to their car, Prince George seemed energized by the experience. "That was brilliant. She had no idea who I was. I felt like I was in a spy film." Harrison smiled, though the comparison struck closer to the truth than the boy realized. It's important for future leaders to understand how ordinary citizens live their lives. You can't govern people effectively if you don't understand their daily experiences. The evening brought the most challenging part of Prince George's training, what Harrison euphemistically called problem-solving under pressure. These sessions took place in a basement room that had been designed to simulate various emergency scenarios. To the prince, these seemed like elaborate puzzle games. In reality, he was learning survival skills and crisis management. Tonight's challenge is called The Lost Tourist, Harrison explained, leading Prince George into a room that had been set up to look like a foreign city street. You're traveling in a country where you don't speak the language fluently. You've been separated from your group, and you need to find your way to safety. The scenario was more sophisticated than it appeared. Hidden cameras recorded every move, and Harrison's assistants played various characters the prince might encounter. The exercise was designed to test his ability to remain calm under stress, assess trustworthy individuals, and navigate unfamiliar situations without revealing his identity. Prince George approached the challenge with the same enthusiasm he brought to all his training. He had learned to treat these exercises as exciting puzzles rather than serious preparations for real dangers. Harrison watched as the boy successfully identified which of the actors might be helpful and which might pose threats, all while maintaining the persona of an ordinary lost tourist. "Well done," Harrison said as the exercise concluded. "You correctly identified the police officer as someone to approach for help, avoided the individual who seemed overly interested in your situation, and found the embassy location using only the map skills we've practiced." As they climbed the stairs back to the main castle, Prince George chatted excitedly about the evening's challenges. "I love these exercises. They're like games, but they make me feel more confident about handling difficult situations." Harrison nodded, though he couldn't share the boy's lighthearted perspective. Each successful exercise brought them closer to completing a training program that might one day mean the difference between life and death for the future king. The protocol's requirements were extensive, and they had barely scratched the surface of what Prince George needed to learn. Back in his private quarters, Harrison updated his daily report for the Queen. She received these briefings personally, reading every detail of her grandson's progress with the intense focus she had always brought to matters of state security. Harrison wrote about the boy's natural aptitude, his enthusiasm for the training, and his complete lack of suspicion about the program's true nature. What he didn't write about was his growing emotional investment in Prince George's well-being. The boy's trust and enthusiasm made Harrison feel like more than just a bodyguard following orders. He was becoming genuinely fond of the intelligent, curious young prince, who approached each new challenge with determination and good humor. The Queen's response came within hours, as it always did. She was pleased with Prince George's progress, but reminded Harrison that the training would intensify significantly as they moved into the second phase. Soon, they would begin exercises that would test not just the prince's practical skills, but his psychological resilience. Harrison closed the file and prepared for another day of leading a double life. Tomorrow, Prince George would continue learning skills he hoped never to use, guided by a man who prayed that 3 centuries of royal preparation would prove unnecessary. But as Harrison had learned during his years of service, hope was not a strategy, and the monarchy's survival depended on preparing for possibilities that no one wanted to consider. The weight of the secret grew heavier each day, but so did Harrison's determination to ensure that if the unthinkable ever happened, Prince George would be ready. The winter months had transformed the training program into something far more sophisticated than anyone outside the inner circle could have imagined. Prince George, now 13 and showing remarkable progress, had no idea that his enhanced education was actually preparing him for scenarios that existed only in the darkest contingency plans of the British monarchy. What he experienced as challenging adventures were, in reality, simulations of crisis situations that could one day determine the survival of the royal bloodline. Commander Harrison stood in the castle's war room, a space that had been secretly repurposed for the succession protocol. Banks of monitors displayed feeds from training scenarios, while detailed maps covered every surface. This room had become the nerve center of an operation that would have seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't seen it develop day by day over the past 6 months. Phase 3 begins today, Harrison announced to his small team of specially cleared assistants. From this point forward, the scenarios become significantly more complex. The team consisted of 3 individuals who had been carefully vetted by the Queen herself. Sarah Chen, a former intelligence operative, specialized in creating realistic cover identities. Marcus Webb, an ex-military survival instructor, handled the physical training components. Elizabeth Hayes, a child psychologist with security clearance, monitored Prince George's emotional well-being throughout the increasingly challenging exercises. The prince has exceeded all expectations, Dr. Hayes reported, reviewing her latest assessments. His psychological resilience is remarkable for his age. He views each challenge as a game, which actually helps his performance under pressure. However, we need to be careful not to push too hard too fast. Harrison nodded, though he knew they had little choice about the timeline. The protocol's requirements were non-negotiable, and Prince George needed to acquire specific skills within the designated time frame. The Queen's weekly briefings made it clear that world events were making the training more urgent than anyone had anticipated when it began. Prince George arrived for his morning session with the enthusiasm that had characterized his approach to the program from the beginning. At 13, he had grown taller and more confident, carrying himself with the natural poise that came from months of specialized training. He had no idea that he could now blend seamlessly into a crowd, assess threats with the skill of a trained professional, and execute emergency procedures that most adults would find overwhelming. "Good morning, Your Highness," Harrison greeted him. "Today we're beginning what I call extended independence training. Think of it as a camping expedition with some unusual challenges." The prince's eyes lit up with anticipation. These extended exercises had become his favorite part of the training program. To him, they felt like elaborate adventure games that tested everything he had learned. In reality, they were comprehensive simulations designed to prepare him for extended periods without royal protection or resources. "How long will this one last?" Prince George asked, settling into the briefing chair that had become as familiar as his regular classroom seat. 72 hours, Harrison replied, noting the boy's lack of concern about the extended duration. Previous exercises had been gradually increased from a few hours to overnight scenarios, and Prince George had adapted remarkably well to each escalation. You'll be operating with minimal support, using only the skills and resources we provided through your training. The scenario Harrison outlined sounded like an exciting challenge to the prince, but it was actually a sophisticated test of everything the protocol required. Prince George would need to navigate unfamiliar territory, establish contact with designated assets, maintain his cover identity, and complete specific objectives, all while avoiding detection by opposing forces played by Harrison's team. Your cover story is that you're a student named David Collins, Harrison explained, handing over documents that looked authentic to any casual inspection. You're on a school trip that went wrong when your group got separated in bad weather. You need to reach a specific location where help is waiting, but you can only travel during certain hours, and you must avoid being seen by the search parties looking for you. Prince George studied the documents with the careful attention Harrison had taught him to apply to any new identity. The passport, student ID, and other papers all showed a boy who looked exactly like him but lived an entirely ordinary life. He had become skilled at stepping into these alternate personas, never questioning why such elaborate preparations were necessary for what seemed like educational exercises. The weather scenario is particularly challenging this time, Sarah Chen added, pointing to a weather map that showed the kind of conditions that could actually force the protocol into action. You'll need to use the navigation skills we've been practicing, but also adapt to situations where normal routes might be blocked or compromised. The exercise began at dawn in a remote area of Scotland that Harrison had chosen for its similarity to terrain the prince might encounter in a real emergency. Prince George, dressed in ordinary hiking clothes and carrying only basic supplies, set off with the confidence of someone who had successfully completed dozens of similar challenges. What the prince didn't know was that this exercise was being monitored by security services at the highest levels. The Queen herself was receiving hourly updates on his progress, as were select members of the intelligence community who had been briefed on the protocol's existence. This wasn't just training anymore. It was a live test of capabilities that might one day be needed to preserve the monarchy. Harrison followed the prince's progress through a sophisticated tracking system that allowed the team to monitor his location and vital signs without interfering with the exercise. On his screens, he could see Prince George moving through the terrain with the skilled navigation techniques they had practiced, successfully avoiding the search parties while making steady progress toward his objective. His situational awareness is exceptional, Marcus Webb observed, watching as Prince George correctly identified and avoided a staged checkpoint. He's learned to read environmental cues and human behavior patterns better than many trained operatives. The first day of the exercise tested the prince's physical capabilities and basic survival skills. He successfully established shelter, found water sources, and maintained his cover story when questioned by actors playing local civilians. His performance was flawless, but Harrison knew the real challenges would come as the scenario intensified. On the second day, the exercise introduced what the protocol called psychological pressure scenarios. Prince George found himself in situations designed to test his emotional resilience and decision-making abilities under stress. He was forced to make choices about whom to trust, how to respond to apparent threats, and when to abandon original plans in favor of alternative strategies. He's adapting beautifully, Dr. Hayes reported as she monitored the prince's stress responses. His heart rate increases during high-pressure moments, which is normal, but he's maintaining clear thinking and good judgment. The training has given him genuine confidence in his abilities. Harrison felt a complex mix of pride and concern as he watched Prince George navigate increasingly difficult challenges. The boy's success was gratifying, but it also made the reality of why such training was necessary feel more immediate. They weren't just playing elaborate games. They were preparing for scenarios where the survival of the monarchy might depend on a 13-year-old's ability to disappear into the world as an ordinary citizen. The third day brought the exercise's climax, a scenario where Prince George had to make contact with what the protocol termed friendly assets while avoiding capture by hostile forces. The setup was designed to simulate the moment when the prince might need to activate the emergency network that had been established to protect him. Prince George approached the final challenge with the same methodical approach that had characterized his performance throughout the training. He had learned to break complex problems into manageable components, assess risks carefully, and execute plans with precision. Watching him work through the scenario, Harrison was struck by how much the boy had changed since the training began. The 13-year-old who successfully completed the exercise bore little resemblance to the curious but sheltered 12-year-old who had first entered Harrison's training room. Prince George had developed skills and confidence that would serve him well in any future role, whether as a king or as someone who needed to disappear entirely from royal life. "Excellent work," Harrison told him as the exercise concluded. "You've demonstrated mastery of every skill we've covered in this phase of your training." Prince George seemed pleased but not surprised by his success. The gradual progression of challenges had built his confidence steadily, and he now approached even difficult scenarios with the calm assurance of someone who had proven his capabilities repeatedly. "What's next?" he asked, already anticipating the next level of training. Harrison exchanged glances with his team members. Phase 4 would introduce elements that would test not just the prince's skills, but his psychological readiness for the ultimate revelation of the training's true purpose. At some point, Prince George would need to understand what he was really being prepared for, but determining the right moment for that conversation was one of the most delicate aspects of the entire protocol. "We'll be moving into more advanced scenarios," Harrison replied carefully, "situations that will test everything you've learned and push your abilities even further." As they returned to the castle, Prince George chatted enthusiastically about the exercise, analyzing his performance and discussing strategies for future challenges. His eagerness and confidence filled Harrison with both pride and a deep sense of responsibility. The boy trusted him completely, never suspecting that his beloved instructor was preparing him for possibilities that could shatter everything he understood about his life and future. That evening, Harrison submitted his most detailed report yet to the Queen. Prince George's performance had exceeded all expectations, but the training was approaching a crucial transition point. Soon, they would need to begin preparing the prince not just for survival scenarios, but for the psychological reality of what those scenarios might mean for his identity, his family, and his understanding of his place in the world. The Queen's response came with unusual speed. She was pleased with the progress, but reminded Harrison that Phase 4 would require even more careful monitoring. They were entering territory where the line between necessary preparation and potential psychological damage became increasingly difficult to navigate. As Harrison prepared for sleep, he reflected on how surreal his life had become. By day, he taught an eager teenager skills that seemed like advanced outdoor education. By night, he planned training scenarios that could one day mean the difference between the continuation and extinction of a royal bloodline that had endured for over 1,000 years. The weight of that responsibility was becoming heavier with each passing week, but so was Harrison's determination to ensure that Prince George would be ready for whatever the future might bring. Tomorrow would begin Phase 4, and with it a new level of complexity that would test not just the prince's capabilities, but the very foundations of the training program itself. The approaching of Prince George's 14th birthday marked a critical juncture in the succession protocol that Commander Harrison had been both anticipating and dreading for months. According to the ancient guidelines that governed the program, this was when the training would shift from skill acquisition to psychological preparation for the ultimate truth. For over 18 months, Prince George had excelled at every challenge, mastering capabilities that would serve him whether he ruled as king or lived in exile as an ordinary citizen. But now came the most delicate phase of all, preparing him to understand why such skills might be necessary. The Queen had requested a private meeting before Phase 4 commenced, and Harrison found himself once again in the familiar study where this extraordinary journey had begun. However, the woman who sat across from him seemed to have aged considerably in the months since their first conversation. The weight of world events and family responsibilities had etched new lines around her eyes, and her usual composure carried undertones of deep concern. "Commander," she began without preamble, "the international situation has evolved in ways that make our preparations more relevant than I had hoped. I need to know that Prince George is truly ready for what may be required of him." Harrison had been expecting this conversation, but the Queen's directness still caught him off guard. Throughout the training period, he had received occasional hints about external pressures that were influencing the timing and intensity of the protocol, but this was the first time the Queen had spoken so openly about immediate concerns. "Your Majesty," Harrison replied carefully, "Prince George has exceeded every benchmark we established. His practical skills are exemplary, his psychological resilience is remarkable, and his ability to maintain cover identities is genuinely impressive. However, he still believes this is advanced leadership training. The question isn't whether he's ready for the skills, it's whether he's ready for the truth." The Queen nodded slowly, her fingers drumming against the mahogany desk in a rare display of nervous energy. "Phase 4 of the protocol requires that we begin introducing him to the reality of why these skills might be necessary. It's a gradual process, but it must begin now. The world is becoming increasingly unstable, and our family's position is less secure than the public realizes." Harrison felt a chill run down his spine. Throughout the training period, he had focused on the practical aspects of preparing Prince George for hypothetical scenarios. The Queen's words suggested that those scenarios might not be as hypothetical as he had hoped. "What exactly are you asking me to do, Your Majesty?" "Begin introducing controlled stress scenarios that go beyond survival training," she replied, opening a folder that contained documents Harrison had never seen. "Prince George needs to understand that the monarchy faces real threats, that his family's safety cannot be guaranteed, and that there may come a time when he needs to make choices that no 14-year-old should ever face." The folder contained intelligence briefings, threat assessments, and political analyses that painted a picture far more complex and dangerous than anything Harrison had previously considered. He realized that while he had been focused on training Prince George for abstract possibilities, the Queen had been monitoring real-world developments that could make those possibilities concrete. "The next phase involves what we call reality integration," the Queen explained. "Prince George will continue his training, but he'll begin to understand that it's not just educational enhancement. He'll learn about the threats our family faces, the political forces that could destabilize the monarchy, and the historical precedents for royal families who were forced into exile or worse." Harrison studied the documents, feeling the weight of responsibility shift once again. Training Prince George to survive hypothetical scenarios had been challenging enough, but preparing him to psychologically process real threats to his family's safety was an entirely different order of magnitude. "How gradual is this revelation process?" Harrison asked, thinking about the enthusiastic, trusting boy who would arrive for training the next morning. "Very gradual," the Queen assured him. "We start with historical examples, then contemporary situations affecting other royal families, and gradually help him understand that similar pressures exist here. The goal is to maintain his confidence while building his awareness of reality." The first session of Phase 4 took place in a different room than Prince George was accustomed to. Harrison had arranged the space to look like a serious briefing room rather than a training facility, complete with maps, screens, and the kind of formal seating arrangement that suggested important business rather than educational games. "Today we're going to talk about something different," Harrison began as Prince George settled into his chair. The boy's demeanor showed curiosity rather than concern. After 18 months of increasingly sophisticated training, he had learned to approach new challenges with confidence rather than apprehension. "We're going to study what historians call royal crisis management," Harrison continued. "Throughout history, royal families have faced situations where their traditional roles and expectations were challenged by political upheaval, social change, or external threats. Understanding these situations is crucial for anyone who might one day lead in times of uncertainty." Prince George nodded attentively. This seemed like a natural extension of his education, building on the leadership and crisis management skills they had been developing through practical exercises. Harrison activated the room's main screen, which displayed a timeline of European royal families over the past century. "Let's start with the Russian imperial family," he said, noting the prince's increased attention. "The Romanovs ruled one of the world's greatest empires, but political revolution forced them from power and ultimately led to their deaths. What do you think they could have done differently?" The discussion that followed was carefully structured to introduce Prince George to the concept that royal power was not guaranteed, that political situations could change rapidly, and that even the most established monarchies could face existential threats. Harrison watched the boy's reactions carefully, noting how he processed these historical realities. "It seems like they were too isolated from their people," Prince George observed, showing the analytical thinking that Harrison had been cultivating. They didn't understand how much the political situation had changed, and when the crisis came, they weren't prepared to adapt. "Excellent analysis," Harrison replied, feeling both proud of the prince's insight and sad about the implications of what they were discussing. Now let's look at some more recent examples. Royal families who faced threats and had to make difficult decisions about their safety and their roles. Over the following weeks, the sessions gradually shifted from historical analysis to contemporary situations. Prince George learned about modern security threats facing royal families, political movements that questioned monarchical systems, and the complex balancing act required to maintain relevance while preserving tradition. The Spanish royal family faced terrorism threats in the 1970s and 80s, Harrison explained during one session. They had to completely change how they approached public appearances and family life. Security became a constant consideration, and family members had to learn to live with the knowledge that they were potential targets. Prince George's questions became more sophisticated as he began to grasp the reality of royal vulnerability. Did they ever consider giving up their royal roles for safety? He asked during one particularly intense discussion. Some family members did, Harrison replied honestly. Living under constant threat isn't sustainable for everyone. Some chose to step back from public roles, others left the country entirely. The key is having options and being prepared for different scenarios. The psychological impact of these revelations was carefully monitored by Dr. Hayes, who reported that Prince George was processing the information remarkably well. His confidence remained intact, but he was developing a more realistic understanding of the complexities and dangers inherent in his position. He's beginning to understand that royal life isn't just privilege and ceremony, she noted in her weekly assessment. But rather than becoming fearful, he seems to be approaching these realities as challenges to be prepared for. The practical training has given him confidence that he can handle difficult situations. The turning point came during a session in late spring, when Harrison felt Prince George was ready for a more personal discussion about contemporary threats. "I want to talk about our family now," Harrison said, noting the subtle change in the prince's posture as the conversation shifted from historical analysis to personal reality. "Are we in danger?" Prince George asked directly, showing the kind of straightforward thinking that Harrison had come to respect. "All royal families face certain risks," Harrison replied carefully. "The question isn't whether those risks exist. It's whether we're prepared to handle them effectively. That's what your training has really been about." The revelation that his enhanced education had actually been crisis preparation was absorbed by Prince George with remarkable composure. He asked detailed questions about specific threats, wanted to understand the decision-making process behind the training program, and showed genuine curiosity about the historical precedents for such preparations. "So when you taught me to blend in with ordinary people, you were preparing me for situations where I might need to hide my identity?" he asked. "Among other things, yes," Harrison confirmed. "The goal was to give you options. If you ever need to step away from royal life temporarily or permanently, you'll have the skills to build a different kind of life for yourself." Prince George absorbed this information with the same analytical approach he brought to all his studies. And the survival training, the navigation skills, the emergency procedures, those were all preparing me for situations where normal royal protection might not be available? Exactly. We hope these skills will never be necessary, but if they are, you'll be ready. The most challenging part of Phase 4 was helping Prince George understand that these preparations had been made without his parents' knowledge, and that he would need to maintain that secrecy until the appropriate time came to share the information. "Why don't they know?" he asked. The first sign of real emotional distress that Harrison had seen throughout the entire training process. "Because this knowledge is both a burden and a responsibility," Harrison explained. "Your grandmother made the decision that you should be prepared, but that your parents should be able to focus on their current roles without the additional stress of knowing about these contingency plans." As Phase 4 progressed, Prince George began to demonstrate not just understanding of the training's true purpose, but acceptance of his role in the broader plan. He approached the ongoing exercises with new seriousness, recognizing that they weren't games but preparations for scenarios that could dramatically alter his life and the future of the monarchy. The transformation was remarkable to witness. The enthusiastic boy who had begun training as an adventurer was evolving into a young man who understood the weight of his position and the responsibility that came with being prepared for extraordinary circumstances. Yet his fundamental character remained unchanged. He was still curious, confident, and determined to meet whatever challenges lay ahead. Harrison's reports to the Queen during this period reflected both professional satisfaction and personal concern. Prince George was exceeding all expectations in terms of his psychological adaptation to the truth about his training, but the process of watching an innocent child confront such adult realities was emotionally challenging for everyone involved. As Prince George's 14th birthday approached, Harrison realized that they had successfully navigated one of the protocol's most difficult phases. The prince now understood why his training was necessary, accepted his role in the contingency planning, and maintained the psychological resilience needed to continue preparing for scenarios that everyone hoped would never occur. The next phase would focus on advanced operational capabilities and final preparations for independence, but Harrison knew that the most critical transformation had already taken place. Prince George was no longer just a royal child being prepared for leadership. He was a young man who understood that leadership sometimes required the courage to disappear entirely, if necessary to preserve something greater than oneself. The final phase of the succession protocol began on a gray October morning, exactly 1 week before Prince George's 15th birthday. Commander Harrison stood in the castle's secure communications center, reviewing intelligence reports that made the previous 2 years of training feel prophetic rather than precautionary. World events had shifted dramatically, and what had begun as preparation for distant possibilities had evolved into readiness for increasingly likely scenarios. The Queen entered the communications center with a gravity that Harrison had never seen before. At 88, she moved more slowly than in previous years, but her mental acuity remained sharp as ever. The documents she carried bore the highest classification markings, and her expression suggested that the abstract nature of the succession protocol was about to become very concrete indeed. "Commander," she said without preamble, "I need to brief you on developments that may require us to implement the protocol within the next 12 months. What began as preparation has become operational planning." Harrison felt his stomach tighten as the Queen opened her briefcase and spread several documents across the secure table. Intelligence summaries, political analyses, and threat assessments painted a picture of a world where monarchical institutions were under unprecedented pressure, and where the survival of royal families could no longer be taken for granted. "Political movements across Europe are gaining momentum," the Queen explained, pointing to a map that showed areas of anti-monarchist activity. "Economic instability has created conditions where radical change seems not just possible, but inevitable. Our own situation here is more precarious than the public realizes." The documents detailed scenarios that Harrison had hoped would remain theoretical forever. Economic collapse, political revolution, targeted violence against royal families. The threats that Prince George had studied as historical examples were manifesting in contemporary form across multiple countries. "What does this mean for Prince George's training?" Harrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Phase 5 accelerates everything," the Queen replied. "He needs to complete his operational preparation immediately. More importantly, he needs to understand that these skills may be required in the very near future, not at some distant point in his adult life." The weight of this revelation settled heavily on Harrison's shoulders. For 2.5 years, he had been preparing Prince George for abstract possibilities while hoping they would never materialize. Now he was being asked to prepare a 15-year-old for the reality that his entire world might be about to change forever. Prince George arrived for his morning briefing with the confidence and poise that had characterized his development throughout the training program. At nearly 15, he had grown tall and lean, carrying himself with the natural authority that came from mastering challenging situations repeatedly. His understanding of the training's true purpose had, if anything, increased his dedication to excellence. "Good morning, sir," he said, using the more formal address that had evolved as he matured and their relationship had deepened beyond instructor and student. "Good morning, Your Highness," Harrison replied, noting how the title felt both familiar and strange given everything they had shared over the past months. "Today marks the beginning of what we call final operational preparation. The training becomes significantly more intensive and realistic from this point forward. Prince George settled into his chair with the composed attention that Harrison had watched develop over 2 years of increasingly complex scenarios. The boy who had once approached these sessions as exciting games had evolved into a young man who understood that his preparation might determine not just his own survival, but the continuation of his family's 1,000-year legacy. Based on current world events, Harrison continued, activating screens that showed real-time intelligence feeds, we need to accelerate your timeline. The scenarios we've been preparing for are no longer theoretical possibilities. They represent increasingly likely challenges that you may face within the next few years. The change in Prince George's expression was subtle but significant. Harrison watched as the abstract nature of the training gave way to the recognition that they were now discussing imminent realities. The prince's questions became sharper, more focused on practical details rather than conceptual understanding. "How likely are we talking about?" Prince George asked, studying the intelligence displays with the analytical skills Harrison had spent months developing. "Likely enough that your grandmother believes you need to be fully prepared by your 16th birthday," Harrison replied. "That gives us slightly over a year to complete preparations that were originally designed to span until you turned 18. The accelerated timeline required a complete restructuring of the remaining training program. Sessions that had been scheduled for weekly occurrence would now happen daily. Scenarios that had been planned as gradual progressions would be compressed into intensive experiences. Most significantly, Prince George would begin operating with the kind of independence that the protocol required in actual emergency conditions. "Starting today, you'll be living a double life," Harrison explained. "Publicly, you'll continue your normal royal duties and education. Privately, you'll be completing preparations that assume you may need to activate the protocol with minimal warning." The first element of Phase 5 involved establishing what the protocol termed operational infrastructure. Prince George spent his afternoons working with Sarah Chen to create multiple complete identities, each with detailed backgrounds, documentation, and supporting evidence that would withstand careful scrutiny. These weren't the temporary covers used in training exercises, but permanent alternatives that could support a lifetime of ordinary citizenship. "David Collins is now a real person," Sarah explained, showing Prince George documents that included school records, medical history, and even childhood photographs that had been carefully created to match his appearance. "If you ever need to become David, this identity will support you indefinitely." Prince George studied the documents with fascination and a hint of unease. Seeing his own face attached to a completely different life story drove home the reality of what they were preparing for in ways that no amount of abstract discussion could achieve. "What about my family?" he asked, the first time in months that Harrison had seen genuine worry in the prince's expression. "If I have to become David Collins, what happens to my connection with them?" Harrison had been dreading this question, knowing that it represented the most painful aspect of the entire protocol. In extreme scenarios, maintaining contact with your family might not be safe for them or for you. The protocol is designed to preserve the royal bloodline, even if that means individual family members must sacrifice their relationships to ensure survival. The psychological impact of this revelation required careful management. Dr. Hayes worked extensively with Prince George to help him process the possibility that protecting his family might require abandoning them, and that love sometimes meant accepting separation for the sake of survival. The physical training component of Phase 5 pushed Prince George's capabilities to their absolute limits. Marcus Webb designed scenarios that tested not just his skills, but his psychological resilience under conditions of extreme stress and uncertainty. These weren't the controlled exercises of previous phases, but chaotic simulations that required split-second decision-making under pressure. "You need to be able to function effectively when everything goes wrong simultaneously," Webb explained during one particularly intense session. "Real emergencies don't unfold like training exercises. They're messy, unpredictable, and terrifying." Prince George's performance during these advanced scenarios was remarkable to witness. The confident teenager who emerged from each exercise bore little resemblance to the curious 12-year-old who had begun the program. He had developed not just practical capabilities, but the kind of mental toughness that allowed him to maintain clarity and purpose, even when facing seemingly impossible situations. The most challenging aspect of Phase 5 was what Harrison termed emotional preparation. Prince George needed to develop the psychological resilience required to make decisions that would have been unthinkable before his training began. This meant accepting that he might need to disappear from his family's life, abandon his royal identity, and live with the knowledge that his survival might come at the cost of everything he had previously understood as normal. Leadership sometimes requires sacrifice, Harrison explained during one of their most difficult conversations. But the kind of leadership you might need to provide could require sacrificing your own identity, your relationships, and your dreams for the sake of preserving something larger than yourself. Prince George absorbed these harsh realities with the same thoughtful analysis he brought to all aspects of his training. "If the protocol is activated," he said, "my job becomes survival rather than kingship. Preserving the bloodline becomes more important than preserving my role as heir." "Exactly. You would be protecting the institution of monarchy by temporarily stepping away from it, ensuring that when conditions improve, the royal line can continue." The winter months brought the final operational tests, scenarios designed to verify that Prince George could successfully implement every aspect of the protocol under conditions that closely approximated real emergencies. These exercises lasted for weeks rather than days, requiring him to maintain cover identities, navigate complex political situations, and make strategic decisions with minimal support. Harrison watched these final tests with a mixture of professional pride and deep sadness. Prince George had exceeded every requirement the protocol established, demonstrating capabilities that would serve him well whether he ruled as king or lived in exile as David Collins. But the cost of this preparation was the premature end of his childhood and the burden of knowledge that no 15-year-old should have to carry. "He's ready," Harrison reported to the Queen following the completion of the final assessment. "If the protocol needs to be activated, Prince George has all the skills, knowledge, and psychological preparation required for success. However, I must note that we've asked an extraordinary amount of a very young man." The Queen's response reflected both satisfaction and sorrow. The monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years because individuals have been willing to make extraordinary sacrifices when necessary. Prince George has proven himself worthy of that tradition, even if we hope he never needs to demonstrate it. As Prince George's 16th birthday approached, Harrison reflected on the remarkable transformation he had witnessed over the past 3.5 years. The enthusiastic child who had begun training as an adventurer had become a capable young man who understood that sometimes the greatest service to crown and country required the willingness to disappear entirely. The succession protocol was now complete, its requirements fulfilled by a prince who had mastered every skill necessary for survival in any conceivable scenario. But more than technical capabilities, Prince George had developed the character and wisdom needed to make impossible decisions with grace and purpose. On the morning of Prince George's 16th birthday, Harrison received his final orders regarding the protocol. The training was complete, but his role as guardian would continue indefinitely. In a world where monarchy itself was under threat, Prince George would need a protector who understood both his capabilities and the extraordinary circumstances that had shaped his preparation for leadership. The Queen's final message was brief but profound. The protocol succeeds not when it is activated, but when it provides the confidence and capability needed to face any future with courage. Prince George now possesses both. Whatever challenges lie ahead, the monarchy will endure because he is ready for them. As Harrison closed the protocol files and sealed them in the royal archives, he knew that his most important service to the crown had been preparing a young prince for a future that might require him to sacrifice everything he had been born to inherit. The greatest measure of their success would be that such sacrifice might never become necessary. But if it did, Prince George was ready to preserve the monarchy by temporarily abandoning it. The hidden order had been fulfilled, and the future of the British crown was secure in the hands of a young man who understood that true kingship sometimes required the courage to become nobody at all.